This week on Only in America, from Iowa, a police chief dispels some of the myths surrounding immigration and crime, and he talks about how his diverse community has embraced newcomers.
Not just people of color in different languages, it brought a youth, it brought an employment base, it brought a vibrancy. Did I have people come into the police station and say, it's your job to get rid of these people? Yes. Did I show them the door? Yes.
And from Pennsylvania, the harrowing story of sexual assaults at immigration detention centers.
He was 42 years old, married, white guard. She's a 19-year-old asylum seeker with a 3-year-old.
And lessons on the value of immigration from France's World Cup victory.
All these women in Africa are having babies, too many babies out here, but at the end of the day, let's be real. Okay, wait, those babies won you the World Cup.
From the National Immigration Forum, I'm Ali Noorani with Only in America.
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 Regular listeners know about what you'd probably call my town crush on Storm Lake, Iowa. A few weeks ago, we heard from Storm Lake's mayor. Later this fall, we will hear from their Pulitzer Prize-winning editorialist. It's an amazing town in the middle of the rolling fields of America's Midwest, and it's a town that has evolved into a multicultural community that continues to welcome immigrants. Storm Lake's police chief, Mark Prosser, has witnessed all of these transitions in his 29 years there. We chatted about the changes in population through the years and about his pride in the declining crime rate. But he also told me he's concerned that the Trump administration's crackdown on immigrants may lead to crimes going unreported.
Storm Lake changed, and we started to see much more diversity and many more language spoken here in the 90s, continuing to today. We started to see our crime increase. And there was an automatic knee-jerk reaction by some that says, increase in crime in Storm Lake, increase in diverse population, it's the immigrants' fault. And so we started reporting out early on, in the early 90s, all of the crime by gender and ethnicity.
Really?
Yes, and we continue that today in our annual reports, public reports. To this day, we've never seen a disproportionate representation of any ethnic group in any of our criminal activity.
Okay, so this is really, really important because from a national perspective, when name your politician says that immigrants are committing crimes at a rate higher than expected, we'll point to national data that will say, as the immigrant community, documented or not, has increased, we've actually seen violent crime decrease. We paint that picture at a national level. You're saying that in Storm Lake.
Same story. And so what happened in Storm Lake in the 90s to push crime numbers up is the community grew. It wasn't an issue of a particular ethnic group causing more crime. Our population grew. We went from a community of the high 8,000s to we're around 13 or 14,000 now. So it was just raw numbers. But as we split it out, there was no disproportionate representation in any category. Continuing today, where we're more diverse now than we've ever been, and over our last 10 years, we've seen dramatic decreases in crime. So those who might want to point fingers that different minority groups, different ethnic groups are more involved in crime, that's even more proven to be false in Storm Lake today, because as our population continues to grow, we're seeing 10-year lows in our crime rates, and we're more diverse than we've ever been.
Why do you think that the crime rate has dropped as the communities become more diverse?
Well, I think there's a variety of dynamics there. I think we're a packing plant community. We have 2 large packing plants. That in itself gives you a transient nature to some of your population. And in a smaller community versus a large city, that might have a little bit more impact, that inflow and outflow of people. So some of the transient nature just that is consistent with packing plant communities sometimes brings individuals in that are not, they're not going to be successful in their new jobs, and they get involved in criminal activities. So there's that dynamic. But as more and more folks have come to Storm Lake from all around the country and literally all around the world, more and more folks are staying in Storm Lake and bringing us stability, where there's less of that turnover. Or if there's still the same amount of turnover, the community has grown where it's absorbing that turnover and that transient process. So that in itself has helped Storm Lake, I think, and helped just get our arms around the changing in the community. I think a lot of what has really assisted our crime is our schools and our churches work tirelessly with our immigrant community members as they arrive here to let them know, hey, especially our schools, they're all coming from urban areas, and so many of them have been involved with gang activity and things like that. You don't have to be involved in a gang to be safe in Storm Lake, and they've really groomed that message well over the last
So what's the
few
message
decades.
again?
The message is when they're coming from these large urban areas and they are involved in gang activity, stuff like that. They're meeting with them and grabbing them when they come into their hallways, saying you don't have to worry about that for safety here. You know, we all get along. The gangs are not ruling anything in Storm Lake. You don't have to have that lifestyle. They say it much better than I do, and probably in a different process. But that's the gist of it. And so I think that's helped a lot. I believe our churches have been great leaders.
So before we go to the churches, I want to get to there. But I think the reason I asked again about that message to young people who are coming in, young immigrants who are coming in, and because you're right, they look to gangs as a way of protection, and that's so much a part of the debate around sanctuary cities or MS-13. So I mean, how do you for the broader public kind of separate this national conversation that's driven by fear of MS-13 and gang members to actually this is actually what's happening in Storm Lake and in our schools?
Well, I mean, we've seen the change as Storm Lake started to grow and become more diverse. We saw a marked increase in gang activity, from the graffiti to the colors to the violence to the activity. Year after year have continued to chip away at that, along with our educational professionals and so on, to now our gang graffiti, our gang activity, recognizing any type of organization with any structure to it is virtually gone. I always hesitate to say something like that because sometimes you eat your words, but for the last 2 or 3 years, our gang activity went from really going up in the 90s as our community changed and grew and into the 2000s to we haven't had any gang-related activity in several years. Our graffiti is pretty much gone. And we used to deal with it on a regular basis. It was a real change for the community. I refer to it as an urban philosophy coming to rural America. That we saw what I grew up with and saw in the East St. Louis area now coming to Northwest Iowa unattached to any urban center. And so, but now we've seen that roll back and we're not seeing that. And I really credit the schools for that leadership in getting out in front and being upfront with these kids and working with them as they arrive, because a good portion of our arriving community members, they come from large urban centers. I mean, around the country. They're not coming from other rural communities, or they're coming from large cities from another country. And so they're very much have that urban mindset, and then being dumped in Northwest Iowa. And so that's just been a great success story there.
What's the relationship of your officers to the schools or to young people in Storm Lake?
Well, the police department works tirelessly with outreach. We have a variety of programs, whether it's focus groups, whether we do neighborhood outreaches in the summer. It doesn't work too well in blizzards, where we go into the communities and where we're not there for a call for service, we're not there for a crisis, and we set up like a little office on a block for an hour or two. We bring partners from public health, community health center, council on sexual assault, folks like that, who are with us, Salud, who is a health coalition here in our community. And they partner with us, and they come and we meet people. We're there, we kind of work through the kids to the parents to create relationships. So we have a great relationship with the kids on the street there. Our school resource officer, the folks that are in the school, I mean, they're there every day working with the kids. We just have a philosophy that wherever and whenever we have the opportunity to interact with any community group, children, church, advocacy groups, or whatever, whether it has anything to do with public safety or not, we're in the audience, we're at the table, so they can see us in a manner where we're not dealing with a crisis or an emergency in their life. And that has really paid dividends.
And in some ways, it's a urban community policing strategy that you're implementing in a rural community.
Well, absolutely, but understand and be clear. that community policing came from rural communities and went to the large city.
Well,
That's how
really?
small towns have always done business like that. The big cities didn't. So let's understand that concept.
Well, that got a little tense.
No, not tense, but that whole concept of interaction and getting out of the car and creating relationships, that's a small town philosophy that has spread to the large urban areas.
That makes complete sense. All right, so the role of the faith community.
Our faith community, and I'm spanning 3 decades here, a variety of churches have really stepped up to create committees, organizations, liturgies that are multilingual. We had a combination or a partnership with the Lutheran, Presbyterian, and Methodist churches years ago that helped develop a Southeast Asian Christian ministry where they helped train and bring in their own ministers and create their own worship sites. We have a variety of our Christian churches that have worked with the Sudanese and Somalian populations in order to create worship locations for them. The church that I go to, a Catholic church, we provide masses in 5 languages here
Really?
in Storm Lake. Yeah.
Wow.
And
how
so
many people are there in Storm Lake?
14,000.
So 14,000 people, and your church provides masses in 5 languages.
Yes, English, Spanish, Lao, Micronesian, and Vietnamese. And so, we have one of the few Buddhist temples, Lao Buddhist temples in Storm Lake. I think there might be one other in Iowa, in Des Moines. Yeah. That's a wonderful facility with their chapels and worship areas and things like that. So, the churches have really done a lot of outreach and a lot of work extending that welcoming hand.
Over the last 3 decades, it's an amazing story, right, of kind of where Storm Lake is today. But over those 3 decades, I can't imagine that it has been a smooth ride. What are some of the bumps in the road that you've encountered as others in the community have really wrestled with these changes, and your role as a police chief to really help people understand?
Bar none, the number one challenge is communication. Depending on which study you want to look at, we have about 30 languages spoken in this community. And if you look around, we're not part of any urban area. So having the resources to provide multilingual services with that many different languages has been and is the challenge, that we ensure that we are appropriately serving everyone who comes to work and live in Storm Lake and play here. And I feel very responsible that we don't make any mistakes there because of language. So that's our number one and our biggest challenge, bar none. How do we communicate? How do we know the needs of our citizens and our community members, and how do they know the expectations and rules of Storm Lake, Iowa in general? And so that has always been the challenge. However, what was a crisis in 1990 when we didn't have bilingual staff and interpreters on staff as the first, of course, we already had Lao and Vietnamese here from the Southeast Asian first wave. Now we're getting a variety of Spanish-speaking community members from a variety of Spanish-speaking countries, just not from Mexico, which was a learning experience for Northwest white America. That was a real challenge. How do we provide services and get interpreters at 3 a.m. and things like that led to some pretty extensive studies as far back as 1991. And then to today, where if we get word that another ethnic groups moving to Storm Lake that's speaking another language, it's kind of like, okay, we kind of know where to look for help and how to overcome those.
What I'm getting at here is conservative white rural America. How do you communicate these changes to them?
Well, that's been a process. And I can tell you that back in the early 90s and into the mid 90s, again, we saw the change in ethnicity, more languages coming to Storm Lake, a growth in the community. Of course, there was increasing crime because of the increasing growth. There was just this change. There would be a variety of groups that I would speak with and interact with that it's almost like they were holding their collective breath, like, this is going to be over soon, and we're going to go back to the way we were. And I spoke quite often that says you have to look at the trends of our country and look at the needs of the city and the employment that the city needs. That this is Storm Lake forever. That's kind of when we went on the speaking trail. And initially it was at that time the school superintendent, not our current superintendent, hospital administrator, and I. We would kind of go on a team trips.
Really?
We would speak around the community, we would speak around the region, and really talk about the success stories and the great positive things we saw from our community, because not just people of color in different languages, it brought a youth, it brought an employment base, it brought a vibrancy. our schools have incredible challenges here because of growth. Other schools in Iowa are consolidating and closing. Which problem do you want? We have an incredible need for housing here. We don't have enough housing. What do you want? A need for housing or empty housing?
Or empty houses.
So,
right.
I mean, both tough challenges for elected officials and those who have to deal with finances, but which problem do you want? And so that was just a constant drumbeat and a constant, at least on my part, a constant message out there of what the truth was about crime, who was committing crime, and dispelling myths. And it's truthfully something we still do today.
Yeah.
And so Storm Lake is often criticized that it has more crime because of this or because of that group or whatever. And we're constantly out there saying, no, we're just growing. And now our crime's coming down, and things like that, which we're very proud of. Did I have people come into the police station and say, it's your job to get rid of these people? Yes. Did I show them the door? Yes. But there was certainly that attitude. But I have to tell you, one of the reasons that I have been drawn to stay in Storm Lake is racism is alive and well here. But as a whole, that's right. But as a whole, this community from day one took a step back and threw their arms out, be it through education, through health, through marketing strategies in stores and everything. And I've just always been very proud of them. They've just really done well.
So earlier this year, the state legislature decided to move forward with what they called an anti-sanctuary cities bill, and yourself and Mike Tupper were right out of the gates talking about the need for community safety and trust with the local immigrant community. So I was wondering if you could lay out a little bit of why you felt it was important to take a really clear stand in favor of law enforcement in light of this really, really, really awful debate around, quote, sanctuary cities.
Well, there was a couple different reasons. One is Iowa didn't have a problem with sanctuary cities. There were no sanctuary cities in Iowa, number one. Number two, it was a direct attack on local control. The state legislature has never passed any other law that impacted the policies of any police department in the state of Iowa. From use of force to pursuit to the types of weapons, very high profile, potentially controversial topics that law enforcement get involved with, nothing. It's left to local policies, of course, case law, training, working with your attorneys and insurance companies and things like that, which it has always been. Not one other state code applies or mandates any type of police policy, and all of a sudden we jump with 2 feet into the immigration issue. Third of all, in conjunction with no sanctuary cities, Iowa law enforcement was doing it right. I mean, the general public really didn't understand that if you arrest somebody and fingerprint them, it goes to a database.
Yeah.
And ICE tells you what they need or don't need, and then the jails decide if they're going to hold or whatever based on their legal counsel. None of that changed, and none of it has changed with this legislature. But the big reason that Chief Tupper and I and other law enforcement administrators and our Police Chiefs Association and every other association in the state of Iowa except the Minutemen oppose this legislation is the harm it would do and the harm it has done to the psyche of our people. This legislation really only deals with people who are under arrest for a criminal event. And so in the scheme of things, it doesn't really impact an undocumented or a documented person walking down the street or in a house or whatever. It doesn't. But it's the perception. And it's the belief that, and the lack of understanding that our local law enforcement is now going to get involved in the immigration business because our local law enforcement by January of 19 are now mandated to have a policy about sanctuary cities and how we are working with our federal partners, how we're going to deal with that when there was no criticism of Iowa law enforcement for working with our federal partners. The city of Iowa City, where the University of Iowa is, had a resolution that referenced wanting to be welcoming in a sanctuary city that created this whole momentum at a state level. But in their resolution, it clearly states, if you read the entire resolution, that we will always cooperate in investigations with our federal partners. It goes right down the line. What our statement, our philosophy does not detract from what we're going to do with our federal partners. But people didn't read the second half of the resolution, and this started. And so, we had a real concern, and we are experiencing that now in Storm Lake.
Yeah.
That folks, because they know that there's sanctuary city legislation, we are aware, and we've been told multiple times of folks who have been victimized, who've been sexually assaulted, who's been physically assaulted, who don't want to report it, and they're not willing to come forward either as victims or as witnesses because they don't know where the police are in this whole immigration enforcement. We've tried to stay out in front of that, and I have been very outspoken for years and continue to be that I don't believe local law enforcement should be in the immigration business, and we're not going to be in the immigration business in Storm Lake unless it's a criminal investigation, and there's a difference there. We even made a video that we put out on social media that was in English and Spanish and a touch of Lao that tried to share that message and move it through the community. And that was after about the fourth time I was notified that saying, hey, there's people that they want to talk to you, but they're not.
So going back to, number one, we just in DC were incredibly grateful for not just the communications work that you did around the legislation and the work that you and your colleagues did across the state. But I wanted to go back to where we started the conversation around data. Do you think that these changes and the decrease in reporting of crime will be borne out in the data as you move into the next year?
Well, we'll see, but that's the question. Is crime gone down? Or does it continue to go down, or is it not being reported? And following some of the statements, counterpart chief in Houston and Art and some of these other folks that are really seeing, of course they have much bigger numbers and data to deal with. We probably have an advantage in a community this size to get out and get our message out, working because we pushed it out through churches and through advocacy groups and as far as we could. And continue to beat that drum that we want folks to come and talk to us, and they don't have to be worried if they're a victim of a crime and so on. It'll remain to be seen how successful we are. And of course, the other concern I had as an administrator, especially an administrator in such a diverse community, is does this move on the part of the state legislature as it applies to sanctuary city for those who are under criminal arrest, is that it? Or is that the first step of other waves?
A couple more questions for you. You alluded to this a little bit, but what role does the church play in your approach to law enforcement?
I've always been raised in a very active Catholic family. My mom and dad were missionaries in Guatemala for 30 years. Dad was a dentist, worked through the Catholic Church down in East St. Louis to do that kind of stuff. So my wife works full-time for the Catholic Church and Catholic school. I've just had great examples around me of people of faith and people of service. And so I work very, very hard. I'm an ordained deacon in the Catholic Church. And so on weekends, I have vestments on and I'm up on the altar. I work very hard to keep a separation of church and state. I feel a responsibility to my staff that I'm not in there preaching to them. But be clear that prayer guides my day every day.
Last question, or request, if you will. Name of the podcast is Only in America. So of everybody I've talked to, I asked them to complete this sentence. Only in America, ...
Only in America can everyone have the ability to fulfill their dreams.
Chief, thank you so much.
Thank you. And thanks for being here.
Really, really appreciate it. Mark Prosser is the police chief of Storm Lake, Iowa. There's more about Chief Prosser at our website, immigrationforum.org, where you can subscribe to our podcast and take a second to write a review on iTunes. This is Only in America. I'm Ali Narani.
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the James Irvine Foundation, expanding opportunity for the people of California, and from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, established in 1911 by Andrew Carnegie to promote the advancement and diffusion of knowledge and understanding.
The euphoria across France last weekend was heard around the world and echoed strongly through Africa, since most of the French World Cup winning team were first or second generation African immigrants. Here's popular YouTuber Galia Regalia not mincing any words.
Today is July 15th, 2018. It's a summer day, it's a Sunday, and the France team has won the World Cup. France is happy, obviously Croatia is not happy, but France is happy, and a lot of Africans are happy because, let's be honest, the team is African. It's not European, it's not French, it's an African team.
And in the New Yorker magazine, Adam Gopnik said France's victory was a cultural message to President Trump. He wrote, "Competing against the world around you means to compete with the world around you, to have the world and all its resources on your side, rather than shutting off from them in an insular tantrum. Having taught this lesson to the world for so long, it's now a lesson for the world to teach us." Speaking of lessons, we're learning more and more about what life is like in some of the detention centers set up to house immigrant women. One of the most disturbing accounts that I have ever seen comes from a New York Times video report, which details the sexual assault of a young immigrant mother at the Berks facility near Reading, Pennsylvania. The victim, identified as ED, fled an abusive relationship in Honduras and claimed asylum with her 3-year-old son. At Berks, she was pursued and attacked by Daniel Sharkey, a 42-year-old guard who eventually pleaded guilty to institutional sexual assault.
Her life experience is one in Honduras of being brutally beaten and raped by her partner. But she was also in this Berks County facility that is purported to provide a safe space for these families while they go through the immigration process.
Él entró al baño y me quitó mi ropa.
He came into the bathroom and he took off his clothes. I couldn't say no. I couldn't say anything. I just simply did what he wanted.
The video, you really have to see it, goes on to reveal that several thousand sexual assault allegations have been made by immigrants at detention centers over the last decade, but fewer and fewer are being properly investigated. Keep in mind that the Trump administration is looking to ramp up immigrant detentions at a time when oversight and accountability is plummeting. Meanwhile, Tucker Carlson redirected criticism of President Trump's performance in Helsinki by blaming Mexico. I know, that's totally unexpected. According to Tucker, apparently Mexicans come to America to stack the election. Here's what he said Monday night on Fox News.
I mean, I'm not a shrink, so I don't fully understand it. I don't think Russia is our close friend or anything like that. I think, of course, they try to interfere in our affairs. They have for a long time. Many countries do, some more successfully than Russia, like Mexico, which is routinely interfering in our elections by packing our electorate. So those are all concerns.
That is an impressively racist redirect there, Tucker. But lest we forget, the U.S. government took thousands of children away from their parents at the U.S.-Mexico border. Through public outrage and strong legal resistance, the reunification of families has started. The next couple of weeks will be pivotal as the administration comes up against the court-ordered July 26th deadline to reunify all these families. But ultimately, how long it will take and what becomes of these families remains quite unclear. That's our show for this week, with thanks to producers Emily Chow and Regina Medina, and executive producer Kathleen Farrell, and the whole team at the National Immigration Forum. I'm Aline Irani. See you next time on Only in America.